The wind, a dry and heartless beast, scoured the town of Redemption Gulch, whipping dust into the eyes of the righteous and the damned alike. It offered no relief from the sun's tyrannical glare, a sun that beat down upon the raw timber of the saloon, the stoic facade of the general store, and the beaten earth of the town square, where a life was being sold for the price of a few bottles of cheap whiskey. Ilara stood on a splintered crate, a ghost in a threadbare calico dress, her world a maelstrom of noise she had trained herself to ignore. The jeers of the crowd, the leering appraisals of hard-faced men, the desperate, wheedling voice of her own father, they were all just vibrations in the air, a storm she had learned to weather by retreating into the unbreachable fortress of silence. She was, as far as this town knew, the deaf girl, a flawed piece of property her father, Jedediah, was attempting to offload. Her face was a placid mask, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the sweat-stained hats and rotting teeth, a trick she had perfected over years of enduring his drunken rages. Inside, her soul was a trapped bird, beating its wings raw against the cage of her ribs. Each catcall was a stone thrown, each lascivious grin a violation. Jedediah, his face florid and his breath a foul testament to his morning's libations, gestured wildly toward her. "A good wife," he slurred, his voice cracking. "Strong, hard-working, and best of all, she won't talk your ear off with womanly nonsense. Can't hear a thing. Bless her heart. What am I bid for this fine, quiet girl?" The crowd chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through the soles of Ilara's worn boots. A stout, pig-eyed man named Barlow, who owned the largest tract of land and the blackest reputation in the county, licked his lips and tossed a coin. The bidding began, a grotesque auction of her future, each meager offer a nail in the coffin of her hope. She felt the vibrations, the rising tide of ugliness, and she braced herself, praying for the world to swallow her whole. Have you ever felt so lost, so utterly alone, that silence becomes your only sanctuary? This is a story about a silence that was chosen, and a silence that was broken. It is a tale of two souls adrift in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the American West, each imprisoned by a past they could not escape. It is the story of a man whose heart was a frozen plain, and a woman who carried a fire within her that no one, not even she, knew she possessed. It's a story about how sometimes the only person who can truly hear you is the one who isn't listening with their ears. The bidding stalled, hovering at a price that would barely keep her father in liquor for a month. Barlow looked smug, confident in his victory. Ilara closed her eyes, preparing for the inevitable. And then a new vibration cut through the din. A deep, steady voice, as solid and unyielding as the distant mountains. $50. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The sound was so different, so devoid of the sneering cruelty she was used to, that Ilara's eyes snapped open against her will. He stood at the edge of the assembly, a figure carved from shadow and granite. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked as though it had been weathered by more than just the sun and wind. There was a stillness about him, a profound solitude that set him apart from the boisterous crowd. He was a man who seemed to carry his own wilderness within him. He did not look at the auctioneer. He looked at her, and in his gaze, for the first time that day, she did not see possession or pity. She saw nothing. A vast, empty quiet that was, in its own strange way, a mirror of her own. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, she felt seen, not as an object, but as a soul. The moment stretched, the dusty air thick with unspoken tension, the fate of her entire world hanging on the next word spoken in the suffocating heat of that forgotten town. The man who had spoken was Silas Blackwood, a name that meant little to the townsfolk of Redemption Gulch. He was a specter, a man who came to town twice a year for salt, flour, and bullets, his face a mask of indifference, his words as sparse as rain in a drought. They knew he had a ranch somewhere out in the lonely lands to the north, a place where the wind howled and the coyotes sang eulogies to the moon. They whispered that he had fought in the war, that he had come back a changed man, a man hollowed out by unspeakable loss. Silas hadn't come to town to buy a wife. He had come for fence wire and coffee. He had intended to be on his way back to his solitary kingdom before the sun reached its zenith. back to the familiar company of his horses and the ghosts that haunted the corners of his quiet cabin. But the raw, ugly spectacle in the town square had snared him. He had seen the girl on the crate, her stillness a stark contrast to the drunken theatrics of the man who called himself her father. He saw the practiced emptiness in her eyes, a defense he knew all too well. He had worn that same mask for years, a shield against a world that had taken everything from him, his wife, Sarah, and his little daughter, Lily, victims of a fever that had swept through their homestead while he was away fighting a war for men who had never known a day of real loss. He had returned to a silent house and 2 fresh graves on a windswept hill. The silence they had left behind was a living thing, a malevolent entity that had consumed him from the inside out. Now he saw a different kind of silence in this girl, a silence she had built around herself like a fortress. He saw the predator in Barlow's eyes, the casual cruelty of the crowd, the pathetic greed of her father, and something inside him, a rusty, forgotten mechanism of honor and protection, grown to life. He wasn't saving her. He told himself he was merely disrupting the ugliness, throwing a stone into the stagnant pond of their depravity. The $50 was more money than he'd held at one time in years, the sum of a long season of trapping and selling pelts. It was a reckless, foolish act, and every rational part of his mind screamed against it. But the sight of her, so small and so defiant in her forced stillness, resonated with the part of his soul that was still human. Barlow, his face purpling with rage, sputtered, $50? For a deaf-mute. He glared at Silas. Who in blazes are you? Silas didn't answer. He just held Barlow's gaze, his own eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. His silence was more intimidating than any threat. Barlow, for all his bluster, was a bully, and bullies are cowards at their core. He saw the unyielding resolve in Silas's stance, and, after a moment of sputtering indignation, he spat on the ground and shoved his way back through the crowd, muttering curses. Jedediah, his eyes wide with disbelief and avarice, scurried over to Silas. $50, you said? In gold. Silas pulled a worn leather pouch from his coat, the clink of coins silencing the remaining whispers. He counted out the money into Jedediah's trembling, grimy hand. The transaction was swift and brutal. There were no papers signed, no pleasantries exchanged. It was the purchase of a human being, stripped of all ceremony. Jedediah pocketed the coins with a greedy desperation, his eyes already gleaming with the thought of the oblivion they would buy him. He turned to Alara, grabbing her arm with a rough jerk. He's your man now, girl. Go on. He shoved her forward, and she stumbled, catching herself before she fell. She did not look at her father. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear or her pain. She raised her eyes to the tall, silent man who now owned her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. He had saved her from Barlow, but what kind of monster had she been sold to now? He was an unknown country, a vast and intimidating wilderness, and she was about to walk into it, utterly and completely alone. The journey to Silas's homestead was a long, slow passage through a world that seemed to grow emptier with every turn of the wagon wheels. The crude track leading out of Redemption Gulch quickly dissolved into a faint trail winding through sagebrush and rock, the mountains looming in the distance like sleeping giants. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon, the soft thud of the horse's hooves, and the ever-present sigh of the wind. Silence was the language of this land, and it was a language both passengers spoke fluently, though for entirely different reasons. Ilara sat stiffly on the wagon bench, her hands clenched in her lap, her gaze fixed on the endless expanse of pale blue sky. Every bump and lurch of the wagon was a jolt to her frayed nerves. She was a prisoner being transported to an unknown jail, her jailer a silent, unreadable man whose motives were a terrifying mystery. She had been saved from the immediate, vulgar threat of a man like Barlow, but what awaited her at the end of this journey? She replayed the scene in the town square, his sudden, decisive intervention. He hadn't leered. He hadn't smiled. He had simply acted, a force of nature as quiet and potent as a gathering storm. Still, men were men. Her father had taught her that lesson with every empty promise and every angry blow. She had learned that a man's kindness was often just a mask for his desires, a patient trap for the unwary. So she waited, her feigned deafness a shield, her face a carefully constructed blank canvas. Silas, for his part, was locked in a battle with himself. The stranger beside him was a complication he could not afford. His life was a carefully balanced ecosystem of work, solitude, and memory. He had arranged it that way, a penance for not being there when his family needed him. His ranch was his monastery, his work a prayer to keep the ghosts at bay. Now he had brought a living, breathing woman into his sanctuary, a woman with eyes that held a universe of silent suffering. He could feel her fear radiating from her like heat from a stove. He wanted to tell her she was safe, but the words felt like ash in his mouth. What did he know of safety? He hadn't been able to keep his own wife and daughter safe. The words would be a lie, a hollow promise from a broken man. He drove the team with a steady hand, his knuckles white on the reins. He was acutely aware of her presence, the slight weight of her on the bench, the scent of dust and soap that clung to her. It was an unwelcome intrusion, a reminder of a life he had long since buried. As the sun began its descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, a chill crept into the air. He saw her shiver, a tiny, involuntary tremor. Without a word, he reached behind him into the wagon bed and pulled out a thick wool blanket. He didn't look at her. He simply held it out. She flinched when he moved, her eyes wide and startled. He held the blanket still, a silent offering. After a long moment, her small hand reached out, her fingers brushing against his as she took it. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through him, a spark of warmth in the frozen landscape of his soul. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, her movements slow and deliberate. She did not look at him, but he saw the slight softening of her rigid posture. It was the smallest of gestures, a silent exchange in a silent world, but it was the first stone laid in the foundation of something neither of them could yet imagine. The foundation of trust. The wagon rolled on into the twilight, two lonely figures moving through a vast and indifferent land, each wondering if the other was their damnation or, just maybe, their salvation. The wagon crested a final rise, and below them, nestled in a shallow valley carved by a winding creek, lay Silas's ranch. It was not a place of comfort or charm, but of stark, unyielding function. A small, sturdy log cabin stood sentinel, smoke curling from its stone chimney, like a lonely prayer. A solid-looking barn, a corral, and a web of fences completed the small pocket of order carved out of the sprawling wilderness. To Alara, it looked like the end of the world, a place so remote, so isolated, that a scream would be swallowed by the wind before it traveled 10 feet. Her fear, which had been a low hum during the journey, now crescendoed into a silent shriek. This was it, the place where her fate would be decided, far from any prying eyes, far from any hope of rescue. Silas brought the wagon to a halt near the cabin. He climbed down, his movements economical and sure, and began to unhitch the team. He worked with a quiet competence that was almost mesmerizing. He didn't look at her or speak to her, simply went about his tasks as if her presence was both expected and entirely unremarkable. Ilara remained on the wagon bench, clutching the wool blanket around her, a small, frozen statue. He led the horses to the barn, and she watched him go, her mind racing. Should she run? But where would she go? The wilderness that surrounded the ranch was a more certain death than whatever awaited her in that cabin. After what felt like an eternity, Silas emerged from the barn and walked to the cabin door. He pushed it open and then turned, finally looking at her. He gestured for her to come inside. With a deep breath that did little to calm the frantic beating of her heart, she slid off the bench. Her legs were stiff, and she nearly stumbled on the hard-packed earth. She walked toward the cabin, each step an act of immense will. The interior was as Spartan as the exterior. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs sat in the center of the single room, and a bed was tucked into a far corner. It was a man's space, clean but devoid of any softness. But there was another door, one she hadn't expected. Silas walked to it and opened it, revealing a small, closet-sized room. Inside was a simple cot with a neatly folded blanket and a small washstand with a basin and pitcher. It was little more than a cell, but it was separate. It was a space of her own. Silas turned back to the main room, picked up a piece of charcoal from the hearth, and wrote on a piece of scrap wood he pulled from a box near the fire. He held it up for her to read. The letters were blocky, unpracticed, but clear. "This is your room. You are safe here." Ilara stared at the words, her mind struggling to process them. Safe. It was a word that had become foreign to her, a concept that belonged to a different life, a different girl. She looked from the words to his face. His expression was unreadable, a mask of stone, but his eyes held a deep, weary sadness that seemed to echo her own. He expected nothing. He was not going to drag her to his bed. He had offered her not a cage, but a sanctuary. Her mind, so long conditioned to expect the worst from men, couldn't reconcile his actions with her experience. This quiet, wounded man had paid a small fortune for her, brought her to his isolated kingdom, and then offered her dignity. A wave of confusion and an emotion she couldn't name washed over her. Still clinging to the shield of her deafness, she gave a small, hesitant nod. She walked into the small room and placed her hands on the rough wool of the blanket on the cot. Through the open door, she watched as Silas began to prepare a simple meal of beans and bacon, his movements methodical, his presence filling the small cabin with a profound and lonely silence. She began to observe him, not as a captor, but as a puzzle. She watched the way his large, calloused hands were gentle as he stoked the fire. She saw the way he stared into the flames, his thoughts 1,000 miles away in a land of sorrow. In the flickering firelight, she saw the deep lines of grief etched around his eyes. And for the first time in a very, very long time, the iron band of fear around her heart loosened, just a fraction. The days bled into weeks, each one a mirror of the last, marked only by the slow, inexorable march of the sun across the vast, empty sky. A rhythm established itself, a silent dance of shared existence. Ilara would rise with the first hint of dawn, the chill of the cabin a sharp reminder of her solitude. She would find Silas already gone, the fire in the hearth banked and glowing, a pot of coffee kept warm for her. He would be out with the horses or mending a distant fence line, his tireless work a constant battle against the encroaching wilderness, and, she suspected, the wilderness within himself. She took it upon herself to manage the cabin. It was a small world, but she could make it her own. She scrubbed the floors, washed their meager dishes, and tended to the small vegetable patch behind the cabin with a fierce determination. The feel of the soil in her hands, the sight of new green shoots pushing through the earth, was a balm to her wounded spirit. It was life. It was hope. And she, who had been treated as less than human, found a quiet joy in nurturing it. She still wore her deafness like a cloak, a familiar weight that offered protection. It allowed her to observe, to listen with her eyes and her heart. She learned the map of Silas's grief. She saw it in the way he would sometimes stop, his hand resting on a fence post, and stare at the two small, weathered crosses on the hill overlooking the ranch. She saw it in the evenings when he would sit by the fire, cleaning his rifle or mending a piece of leather, his face a mask of stoic concentration, but his eyes lost in a painful past. She learned that he was a man of profound kindness, a kindness expressed not in words, but in deeds. He left a bucket of fresh, clean water for her on the porch every morning. He repaired the sole of her worn-out boot without her having to ask. Once, when a hawk had been circling the chicken coop, he had spent the better part of the afternoon patiently constructing a more secure roof for it. He did these things without expectation of thanks, as if they were simply the right thing to do. Their communication was a tapestry woven from silence and gesture. A nod from him was high praise for a well-cooked meal. A small bowl of wild berries she left on the table for him was her way of saying thank you. They worked together in the garden, their hands moving in the earth just inches apart, a silent communion that was more intimate than any conversation. One night, a storm rolled in, and the sound of her own fear kept her awake. She lay on her cot, listening to the wind howl and the rain lash against the small window. From the other room, she heard a new sound, a low, pained muttering, curiosity warring with her fear. She crept to the door and peered through the small crack. Silas was in his bed, tossing and turning in the throes of a nightmare. Sarah. Lily. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice thick with a raw, undiluted agony that pierced Alara's heart. I should have been there. She stood there for a long time, a silent witness to his private hell. The strong, unbreachable man was gone, replaced by a husband and father mourning a loss so profound it had hollowed him out. She wasn't just a refugee he had taken in. She was a ghost in a house already crowded with them. Listening to his sleeping confession, a powerful wave of empathy washed over her, extinguishing the last embers of her fear of him. He was not a monster. He was a man drowning in sorrow, just as she was. Their wounds were different, but their pain spoke the same language. She retreated to her room, the man's heartbroken whispers echoing in her soul. That night, her feigned deafness felt less like a shield and more like a wall, a barrier not just to the world, but to the one person who seemed to understand the language of silence as well as she did. The bond between them was no longer just about safety. It was becoming something deeper, something rooted in a shared understanding of what it meant to be broken. The world outside turned white. A sudden, vicious blizzard descended upon the high plains, burying the ranch in a deep shroud of snow and wind. The sky, the land, the air itself, all became a swirling vortex of white, erasing the horizon and trapping them in the small, warm bubble of the cabin. For days, the storm raged, its fury a constant roar that vibrated through the log walls. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin, the crackling fire, and the two souls huddled within it. The enforced proximity was a crucible, burning away the comfortable distance they had maintained. The silent routines of their days were disrupted. They were forced to share the small space, to move around each other, their orbits now intersecting in ways they couldn't avoid. The silence, once a peaceful buffer, now felt charged, thick with unspoken thoughts. On the second night of the storm, the temperature plummeted. Despite the roaring fire, a bitter cold seeped through the cracks in the walls. Alara, huddled on her cot in her small room, shivered uncontrollably, her thin blanket no match for the Arctic chill. She heard a noise from the main room, the scrape of a log being placed on the fire, the soft thud of Silas's boots on the floorboards. Her door creaked open. She tensed, her body going rigid. Silas stood in the doorway, a large, dark-shaped silhouetted by the firelight. He held his own thick winter coat in his hands. He didn't speak. He simply walked to her cot and gently draped the heavy, sheepskin-lined coat over her. It smelled of wood smoke, leather, and him. It was incredibly warm. He hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering near her shoulder, before retreating back into the main room and closing her door. Under the heavy warmth of his coat, Alara's shivering slowly subsided, but a different kind of tremor started deep inside her. It was an act of pure, selfless care. He had given her his own warmth, choosing to be colder, so that she would not be. The gesture was so profound, so deeply kind, that it brought tears to her eyes. The storm raged on for 2 more days. They rationed their firewood and their food, falling into a new, closer rhythm. They sat at the same table, the firelight dancing on their faces, the howling wind a constant companion. One evening, to pass the time, Silas began to carve a piece of wood. Alara watched his large, capable hands work, whittling away the excess, until a shape began to emerge. It was a small bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. As he worked, his gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, to a small, silver-framed photograph that was tarnished with age. It was the only personal item in the entire cabin. Alara had seen it from a distance, but had never dared to look closely. "That was Sarah," Silas said, his voice quiet, rough with disuse. He seemed to have forgotten, in the insulated world of the storm, that she was supposed to be deaf. He was just a man, lonely and needing to speak. "And our Lily." He didn't look at her, just kept his eyes fixed on the photograph. Lily loved birds. She said they carried messages to heaven. Alara's heart clenched. She remained perfectly still, her face a mask of placid non-comprehension, but inside, she was a tumultuous sea of emotion. She listened as he spoke of them, his words painting a picture of a life filled with love and laughter, a life that had been stolen from him. He spoke of Sarah's smile, of Lily's habit of collecting smooth, white stones from the creek bed. He spoke of the home they had built, not with logs and nails, but with shared dreams. He wasn't speaking to her, not really. He was speaking to the ghosts, letting them out into the warm air of the cabin for a little while. She listened to every word, absorbing his pain, his love, his profound loss. It was a sacred confidence, an unintentional baring of his soul. In that moment, trapped by the raging blizzard, the ice that had encased Silas Blackwood's heart for so long began to crack. And in the warmth of his confession, Elara felt the first true thaw in her own frozen soul. The storm outside was a physical manifestation of the turmoil they had both lived through, but inside the small cabin, something quiet and fragile and beautiful was beginning to grow in the stillness. Spring arrived as suddenly as the winter storm had. The snow melted, feeding the creek until it ran high and fast, and the land, once a monochrome canvas of white, exploded into a riot of green and yellow wildflowers. The air was soft, filled with the scent of damp earth and new life. The ranch, which had been a fortress against the cold, now felt like a cradle of hope. The thaw that had begun in the cabin during the storm continued between Silas and Elara. The silence was different now, easier, laced with a shared understanding that needed no words. He would sometimes catch her eye across the yard, and a small, almost imperceptible smile would touch his lips. She, in turn, found herself humming quietly as she worked in the garden, a sound of contentment she hadn't made in years. The bird he had carved during the storm now sat on the sill of her small window, a constant, tangible reminder of the connection they had forged. Their quiet world, however, was a fragile bubble, and it was about to be burst. One afternoon, as Silas was repairing a harness in the barn and Elara was hanging laundry on a line, the sound of an approaching horse echoed from the trail. It was the first visitor they had had since her arrival. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, pierced Elara's newfound peace. She froze, a wet shirt clutched in her hand. Silas emerged from the barn, his face grim, his hand resting instinctively on the handle of the pistol he always wore at his hip. The rider was Barlow. He sat atop his fine, black horse, looking down at the humble ranch with a sneer. He was dressed in expensive clothes that seemed out of place in the rugged landscape, a vulture in peacock feathers. His eyes, small and greedy, swept over the property before landing on Elara. His gaze was a physical violation, stripping away the sense of safety she had so carefully cultivated. "Blackwood," Barlow said, his voice oozing a false congeniality. "Heard you weathered the winter. I was just in the area. Thought I'd check on my investment." Silas moved to stand between Barlow and Elara, a silent, immovable wall of granite. His voice, when he spoke, was as cold and hard as river stone. "She's not your investment. She's not a thing. You're not welcome here." Barlow chuckled, a nasty, grating sound. "Is that so? I hear you've been living out here all alone with this pretty little creature. Must get lonely. But a deal's a deal. You had your fun, but I'm the one who made the first offer. I've come to collect what's rightfully mine." He ignored Silas and spoke directly to Elara, his voice loud and condescending, as if speaking to a simpleton. "You, girl, pack your things. You're coming with me to a real home, not this pigsty." Elara flinched, but held her ground, hiding behind the solid shield of Silas's back. She could feel the coiled tension in him, the barely restrained violence. "She's not going anywhere," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "This is her home now. Get off my land before I remove you." Barlow's friendly facade vanished, replaced by a mask of pure malice. "This ain't over, Blackwood. You're one man. I have friends. I'll be back for what's mine. And when I do, I'll burn this pathetic little shack to the ground with you inside it." With that, he wheeled his horse around, kicking up a spray of dirt, and galloped away, his laughter echoing back on the wind. The peace of their sanctuary was shattered. The ugly, violent world they had both tried to escape had found them. The air, which moments before had been filled with the promise of spring, was now thick with the stench of a coming threat. Silas turned to Elara, his face a grim mask, but in his eyes she saw a new fire. It was not the cold fire of grief, but the hot, protective blaze of a man with something to lose. The days following Barlow's visit were heavy, with a palpable tension. The idyllic peace of the ranch was gone, replaced by a constant, watchful vigilance. The sky no longer seemed vast and liberating, but empty and exposing. Every gust of wind sounded like an approaching rider. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Silas became a silent guardian, his rifle never far from his side. He patrolled the perimeter of his land at dawn and dusk, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He reinforced the door to the cabin and boarded up the smaller window in Alara's room, transforming their sanctuary into a fortress. He said little, but his actions spoke volumes. He was preparing for war, and Alara knew she was the territory they would be fighting over. A profound and terrible guilt settled in her heart. She had brought this danger to his doorstep. She was the storm that had finally broken over his quiet world. One evening, as she was clearing the table after their silent supper, she found the courage to act. She took the piece of charcoal they used for messages and wrote on a scrap of wood, "I should leave. It is my fault." She pushed the piece of wood across the table to him. Silas looked down at the words, his jaw tightening. He stared at her message for a long time, the firelight flickering in his grim eyes. Then he took the charcoal from her and, in his own rough script, wrote a single, emphatic word underneath hers. "No." He pushed the wood back to her. Their eyes met across the table, and in his gaze she saw a fierce, unwavering resolve. It wasn't just about protecting a refugee anymore. It was about defending their home, their life, the fragile peace they had built together. In his simple, stark refusal, he was telling her she belonged. She was not a burden. She was part of this. They were in it together. The waiting ended 3 days later. They came at dusk, 3 riders against the blood-red sunset, Barlow and 2 hired men with cruel, empty faces. They didn't bother with words this time. They rode straight for the cabin, brandishing their rifles. "It's time, Blackwood." Barlow bellowed. "Send out the girl, and we'll let you live." Silas pushed Alara towards her small room. "Stay inside. Bar the door," he commanded, his voice a low, urgent growl. He grabbed his rifle and took up a position by the main window. But Alara did not cower in her room. Peeking through the crack in the door, she watched the scene unfold with a heart that hammered a frantic rhythm of terror and fury. She saw Silas, steady and brave, 1 man against 3. She saw the sneering face of Barlow, a man who saw her as nothing more than an object to be possessed. A lifetime of being silent, of being small, of being afraid, coalesced into a single, blinding point of rage. She would not be a prize to be won. She would not let this good, honorable man die for her. The first shots rang out, splintering the wood of the cabin. Silas returned fire, his aim true, forcing the men to take cover. But they were flanking him, spreading out to attack from 2 sides. As one of the thugs crept towards the side of the cabin, another burst through the front door, which shattered under his heavy boot. Silas whirled to face him, but Barlow took the opportunity to rush the window. In that split second of chaos, the thug inside lunged not for Silas, but for the door to Alara's room. He smashed it open and grabbed her arm, his grip like an iron vise. "Got her!" he yelled, dragging her out into the main room. A triumphant, ugly grin spread across Barlow's face. "It's over, Blackwood. Drop the rifle." Silas froze, his face a mask of agony, caught between protecting himself and protecting her. It was in that moment of horrifying paralysis, with the thug's foul breath on her face and the cold steel of a pistol pressed to her temple, that Alara found her voice. The silence she had worn as armor for years shattered. "Leave him alone." The words erupted from her, not a plea, but a raw, powerful command. The voice was clear, strong, and utterly unexpected. Every man in the room froze. The thug holding her stared, his jaw slack with shock. Barlow's smug grin vanished, replaced by sheer disbelief. Silas's eyes widened, a storm of emotions crossing his face. That single, precious second of stunned silence was all Silas needed. He moved with the deadly speed of a striking snake. He brought the butt of his rifle up in a brutal arc, crashing it into the face of the man who had burst through the door. As that man crumpled, Silas spun, drawing his pistol and firing at Barlow, the shot tearing through the man's shoulder and sending him screaming to the ground. The thug holding Alara, still reeling from the shock of her voice, loosened his grip. It was all the opening she needed. With a guttural cry, she brought her heel down hard on his instep and drove her elbow back into his gut. He grunted in pain, stumbling backward, and she broke free. The confrontation was over as quickly as it had begun. The raw, untamed fury of a woman pushed too far, combined with the lethal skill of a man defending his home, had been more than enough. The silence that fell in the aftermath was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. It was a silence broken only by the whimpering of the wounded Barlow and the ragged breathing of Silas and Alara. The two hired thugs were subdued, one unconscious, the other nursing a broken wrist, their will to fight extinguished. The immediate danger had passed, but a new, more delicate tension filled the small, smoke-filled cabin. The truth was out, hanging in the air between them like a ghost. Alara stood in the center of the room, trembling not from fear, but from the aftershock of her own actions, the sound of her own voice still ringing in her ears. She had shed her silence like a skin, and she felt raw, exposed, and vulnerable in a way she never had before. Silas, after quickly and efficiently tying up their defeated assailants, turned to her. He looked at her not with anger or confusion, but with an expression of profound, aching tenderness. The mask of the stoic protector was gone, and in its place was the man she had heard whispering his grief into the darkness, the man who had carved a bird for her, the man who had covered her with his own coat. The questions were there in his eyes, but they were gentle. "You can speak," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of wonder, of discovery. Tears welled in Alara's eyes, tears she had held back for years. She finally let them fall. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse but clear. "I was so afraid. It was the only way I knew how to be safe, to be invisible. Men, they don't bother with you if they think you're broken." Her confession poured out of her, a story of a lonely, frightened girl trying to survive in a world that saw her as a commodity. She told him about her father, about the endless string of cruelties, about how silence had become her only shield against a world that only wanted to use her. He listened without interruption, his gaze never leaving her face. He was listening not just with his ears, but with his whole being. When she finished, the space between them was filled with a new, fragile intimacy. He understood. He, who had built his own fortress of silence out of grief, understood her fortress of silence built from fear. He stepped closer, closing the final gap between them. He slowly raised his hand, not to grab or to command, but with a gentleness that made her heart ache. He cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. The touch was electric, a current of warmth and acceptance that flowed through her entire body. It was the first truly gentle touch she had known from a man in her entire life. "I heard you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Alara, I've been hearing you all along." He didn't just mean the words she had shouted. He meant he had heard the silent scream of her fear, the quiet dignity of her spirit, the resilient strength of her heart. The final barrier between them dissolved. They were no longer a protector and a refugee, a master and a possession. They were simply Silas and Alara, two broken souls who had, against all odds, found a way to heal each other. The threat was vanquished, their secrets were revealed, and in the ruins of the confrontation, they were finally free to build something new. A year later, the sound of laughter echoed across the valley, a sound as bright and clear as the creek water. The ranch was no longer a fortress of solitude but a home, vibrant with life. New fences enclosed a pasture where a handful of cattle grazed, and the garden had doubled in size, overflowing with vegetables and flowers. Inside the cabin, a colorful quilt, made by Alara, covered the bed, and small, cheerful curtains framed the windows. On the mantel, next to the faded photograph of Sarah and Lily, sat a small wooden bird, a symbol of a love that had taken flight. Silas was a changed man. The deep lines of grief around his eyes had softened, replaced by the crinkles of frequent smiles. He still worked tirelessly, but now his work was a joyful act of building a future, not a desperate attempt to escape a past. Ilara, too, was transformed. Her voice, once a secret weapon, was now used for singing as she worked, for talking with Silas late into the night, for whispering words of love. Her face, once a blank mask, was now open and expressive, her eyes shining with a light that came from deep within. On a warm summer evening, they sat on the porch, watching their infant son, Daniel, sleeping peacefully in a cradle Silas had built. The setting sun bathed the two small graves on the hill in a soft, golden light. They were not forgotten, but they were no longer ghosts. They were memories held in love, part of the story that had brought Silas and Ilara together. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. They didn't need to speak. Their shared silence was no longer born of fear or grief, but of a deep and abiding peace, a love that was stronger than any storm, a home they had built not just with logs and stone, but with the pieces of their once broken hearts. So, we come to the end of our story, but is it ever truly the end? Or is it simply a new beginning, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit? We have walked with Ilara and Silas through the valley of their deepest shadows and watched as they emerged into the light, not unscathed, but stronger, more whole, forever changed by the journey. Theirs is a story that speaks to a fundamental truth, that even in the most profound silence, the heart has a voice that cries out to be heard. It reminds us that courage is not always found in the roar of a battle, but sometimes in the quiet, fierce whisper of a soul that refuses to be extinguished. Think of the silence in your own life. Is it a sanctuary, a place of peace and reflection? Or is it a prison, a wall you have built to protect yourself from a world that has hurt you? Ilara chose her silence as a shield, a way to navigate a world that saw her as less. Silas was condemned to his by a grief so vast it swallowed all words. Yet, in the shared quiet of that remote ranch, they learned a new language, a language of gestures, of shared work, of quiet care. It was a language spoken not by the tongue, but by the soul. Their story is a powerful metaphor for communication itself. How often do we fail to truly hear one another, lost in the noise of our own assumptions and expectations? Silas, in his solitude, learned to see beyond Ilara's feigned deafness. He saw her resilience, her quiet strength, her intrinsic worth. He didn't try to fix her. He simply made a space for her to be safe. And in that safety, she found the strength to heal herself, to reclaim her voice, not just literally, but figuratively. She became the co-author of her own life, no longer a passive object in another story. This is the essence of the redemption arc, not just for Silas, but for them both. He found redemption from his guilt by choosing to protect, by opening his frozen heart to the possibility of a new family. He did not replace the family he lost, but rather honored their memory by choosing to live and love again. Ilara found redemption from her victimhood, discovering her own agency and power. She was not a damsel saved by a knight. She was a survivor who, when the moment came, rose to become a hero in her own right, her voice the catalyst that turned the tide. Their love story is a slow burn, a fire built carefully, log by log. It wasn't a flash of passion, but the gradual, steady growth of trust, respect, and deep, abiding affection. It teaches us that true love is often not about grand declarations, but about the thousand small, unspoken acts of kindness. A warm coat on a cold night, a shared meal in a silent room, a steadfast presence in the face of fear. It is about seeing the other person's wounds and not trying to erase them, but gently holding them and saying, "You are safe with me." So I ask you, what does it mean to build a home? Silas and Ilara show us that a home is not just a structure of wood and stone. A true home is a sanctuary for the heart. It's the place, or the person, with whom you can finally lay down your armor, shed your silence, and be utterly, completely yourself. It's where your past is understood, your present is cherished, and your future is a shared dream. Have you found your home? Or are you still building it? Perhaps the story of the lonely rancher and the girl who found her voice can serve as a blueprint. It reminds us to listen more closely, to love more bravely, and to believe in the possibility of a spring after the harshest winter. It is a story of hope, a reminder that even in the most desolate wilderness, love can plant a garden. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story of love, redemption, and the courage to speak your truth touched your heart, please share it with others who may need to hear it. Let us know in the comments what it means to you to be truly heard. And be sure to subscribe for more inspirational stories that celebrate the strength and resilience of the human heart.